Well arrived, my dear Animorphs. Today, with the arrival of the new build in the beta of Dragonflight, we have gotten, as expected, yet another round of changes to all of the specs and classes. Now, you might be interested in what's changed for the different classes and specs, but you have a problem. You don't want to read through this entire wall of text, because at the end of the day, when you go and check, it's not really interesting to discover that Harrock has been renamed to Havoc, right? You kind of want to see the more pressing matters getting changed, the more salient changes happening to the classes and specs, which is where I come in to give you a recap, to give you a TLDR of all of the actually meaningful changes that happened in this beta build. Now, starting alphabetically, we start with Demon Hunter. Both Havoc and Vengeance have received a few changes. The only important change for Havoc, which is actually going to hurt Vengeance in return, is the fact that Blur, the personal defensive of Havoc, has been taken away from the general 3 of Demon Hunter, and instead now it's just a baseline ability for Havoc. So it's good for you as a Havoc player. You don't have to spend a talent point anymore to learn Blur. It is, however, bad for Vengeance Demon Hunters who are quite happy to be able to get themselves another defensive ability. Now it's gone. Even though the change is for Havoc, it is actually a net loss for Vengeance Demon Hunter. Don't despair, because at the very least Vengeance Demon Hunter gets a significant buff to one of their key abilities, to Fell Devastation. Fell Devastation, instead of healing you for 50% of the overhealing it does, it's now going to heal you for 100% of the healing it does. So obviously it's not going to be as good in Mythic Plus to jump into a new pack and immediately use Fell Devastation when you are at full HP, because now it's not going to give you any extra Absorb Shield. But if you used it a few seconds later, if you use it at 70% or 50% HP, the Absorb Shield you will gain will be massive, because it's going to convert 100% of the healing it does. So it's a significantly stronger ability now. Even now in Shadowlands Mythic Plus keys, for example, the average healing of Fell Devastation is barely worth a Hellstone for Vengeance Demon Hunters when they use it. So this change can actually be very, very powerful. It also, increases the skill ceiling of Vengeance now, properly timing a good Fell Devastation to get a massive shield and the healing as well. It's going to be much more rewarding for Vengeance Demon Hunters. It might not make up for losing Blur as a cooldown, that's true, but at the very least now you have one of your main abilities increased in power. Same with another talent for your build, which is Roaring Fire. Now Roaring Fire also buffs Fell Devastation. Roaring Fire, instead of healing you for 30% more based on your missing health with your Fell Devastation, it heals you for 50% more based on your missing health. So both of these changes go on to buff more or less Fell Devastation for Vengeance Demon Hunter. This is the main change that happens for the Demon Hunter class in this build of the beta. For Druid, there isn't really much. There is just a confirmation of the previous rework we have seen about Balanced Druid. So it's just being put in game for testing. So that's the same thing we already knew about. Feral doesn't really get anything. Don't get spooked, don't get scared if you see something like this showing you that Feral just lost an aura modifier that increased its damage by 32%. You're like, what? Did they just nerf Feral for 32% of its damage? Yes, but they subsequently buffed basically all of the other abilities by that amount, by 30 to 35%. So your Rip, Rake, Shred, Ferocious Bite got buffed in return. So it's just removing the aura modifier of Feral and just increasing the actual damage of the abilities. It's not an actual change per se for Feral. We then have a nerf for Restoration Druid, because Restoration Druid is getting hit in the power of Rejuvenation, which is kind of worrying because Rejuvenation is, in the end, the power of Restoration Druid. First, you have a tiny nerf. You have a tiny passable nerf to Abundance. Now, instead of discounting your regrowth by 6% and increasing its crit chance by 6%, now it's 5% for both, which is whatever. It's not that big of a deal. The real nerfs come in with Rejuvenation itself, which gets nerfed in its total healing by 15%. As a result, Germination, which is the talent that doubles your Rejuvenation casts on the targets, is also nerfed by 15%. That's not all, because Nurturing Dormancy, which was one of the very powerful talents to strengthen your Rejuvenation, has also been nerfed. Previously, if your Rejuvenation was healing a target already at full HP, this talent would make Rejuvenation extend itself by 3 seconds, and it could happen up to 3 times. So you could extend in total Rejuvenation by up to 9 seconds on each player, as long as they were getting healed to full HP. Now that has been nerfed to 2 seconds extension up to 6, instead of 3 seconds extensions up to 9. So Rejuvenation is going to have a net shorter duration overall, even if you take this talent, and will heal for 15% less. So good news for Balanced Druid, because their rework is very good. Bad news for Restoration Druid, because their changes are hitting their strongest and most powerful ability. No news, really, for Feral Druid. You might ask yourself, what about Guardian? We complained a few times already that Guardian is getting abandoned, no changes, no attention whatsoever. Well, I'll tell you what, Guardian actually gets attention this build, because look at this. This is the change to Guardian Druid. Moving on, there is actually one change for all of the specs combined. This will be a change that will be hitting many of these party and raid buffs. Don't get excited, we made a video about the problem of these party and raid buffs that will end up happening in Dragonflight. No, nothing is actually getting fixed. The changes happening to these raid buffs are either tuning them to be less powerful or making them easier to use, but nothing is really going to change. For Druid, the change to Mark of the Wild is a massive nerf. I have just talked yesterday, I think, or 2 days ago, about how powerful and OP Mark of the Wild was compared to all the other raid buffs. Now it gets nerfed. Instead of giving you 3% speed, 3% crit chance, and 2% less magical damage taken, now it's a very boring, soulless 3% versatility. 3% versatility is 3% more damage to your raid and 1.5% less damage taken to your raid. This still makes it mandatory. That absolutely no change for the druids in terms of how important it will be to bring in the raid. It's just way less powerful now compared to how it was before, which is warranted because, as I said before, the raid buff was clearly too powerful for Druid. Then we have Evoker, which isn't really getting any significant changes besides their party buff. This is something that will be changed for the majority of the party buffs in the game, introduced especially in Dragonflight. Those are no longer going to be affecting just your party, they will just affect 4 other players, 4 other targets in your raid, the nearest players. If it's a heal type of buff, they're going to prioritize healers, etc, etc. So it's no longer going to be a minigame in a raid of correctly slotting the right targets in the right groups, because that is no longer how many of these abilities are going to work. In the case of Evoker, Zephyr is the ability which allows you to reduce the damage taken from AoE by 20% and increase the movement speed by 30% in your party. Instead, now it's going to affect you and your 4 nearest allies within 20 yards, so not just limited to your party. There is also a similar change to the other party ability that was given to Hunters. This was the extra talent of your Sentinel Owl new ability, Sentinel's Protection. The old one was giving your party 5% leech and 10% magical damage taken reduction, which is a very good buff. Of course, it's not a raid buff, otherwise it would be super powerful. It was still solid. 5% leech is very good for healers, 10% magical damage reduction is very good, even when you will be in Mythic Plus, for example, hitting your whole party is very good. The change now is that it's not one of the change like the Evoker one, where now it's going to affect allies around you rather than your party. The change is instead that you still gain the 5% leech, but the magical damage taken reduction has been removed. So this is now only going to be a leech buff for Hunter. So just a flat nerf. Nothing else gets changed. The cooldown is not being reduced, the leech is not being increased, it's just a flat out nerf by removing the damage reduction. Poor hunters, I guess. After hunter, you have nothing pretty much for mage happening this build of the beta, and also nothing happening for monks this build of the beta. There is a whole bunch of renaming of talents, fixing of bugs that prevented abilities from working in the beta. Of course, Windwalker was a candidate for having a whole bunch of stuff that wasn't even working in the beta, like Forbidden Technique or Fatal Flying Guillotine or Flashing Face, all stuff that didn't work in the beta. So now it gets fixed, but no actual significant changes to the specs and the talents and whatnot. Who gets changes is Paladin. First of all, let's talk about the main change for all of the 3 specs, which is Blessing of Spell Warding. This was one of the major changes to the availability of abilities of Paladin in Dragonflight, the fact that now Spell Warding was no longer tied to prot. Now Retribution and Holy Paladin were also going to be able to take Spell Warding, which is very, very good. Spell Warding is, generally speaking, more useful than Blessing of Protection, because many of the nastier things that happen in Mythic Plus or in the raid are going to be nasty debuffs, nasty curses, or dots on you and similar things that are all going to be magical. So this was very good. It's not very good anymore, because Blessing of Spell Warding has been removed from the general tree of Paladin and has been brought as a Protection Paladin only talent. Not only that, but now it's also going to be a choice with the option of improved Ardent Defender for Protection Paladin. So either you choose Ardent Defender, reducing your damage taken by an additional 10%, or you choose Spell Warding. You're asking yourself, wait a minute, Spell Warding used to replace Blessing of Protection. Now it's a choice with improved Ardent Defender. Is it going to be able to be used right alongside Blessing of Protection? The answer is yes, but no. It's yes because now you can effectively have both of them in your action bars. It's no because using one will set the other one on cooldown. So you have the option to choose which one you want to use, but once you have used one, the other one is going to go on cooldown as well. Not a fan of this change, removing a bunch of utility from Holy and from Retribution Paladin, taking away Spell Warding. However, there are some buffs at the very least for Holy Paladin. Holy Paladin gets Barrier of Faith, which is getting buffed. Now it's going to be storing 40% of your Flesh Heal and Holy Light healing instead of 20% of your healing. Again, pushing for the caster version of Holy Paladin with this talent. But the real buff for Holy Paladin is Echoing Blessings. So Echoing Blessings gives you 15% move speed when you use Blessing of Freedom, which is okay. It's not really the main course of this buff. The main course of the buff is that it also increases the damage reduction of Blessing of Sacrifice. Also, these effects linger for 8 seconds after the abilities have ended. So this is Blessing of Sacrifice. It has a 2-minute cooldown, which you can reduce to a 1-minute cooldown with a talent. And then it has a 30% damage reduction, which you can increase to 45% damage reduction, and it lasts for 12 seconds. And the damage reduction will linger for an extra 8 seconds after the effect ends. So it becomes an extremely powerful damage reduction now, because for example, the de facto premier damage reduction ability for tanks was Pain Suppression, and Pain Suppression was 40% damage reduction for 8 seconds. With this talent, Blessing of Sacrifice becomes a 45% damage reduction for 12 seconds, and an extra 15% damage reduction for 8 seconds after that. It makes it an extremely good single target damage reduction ability for Holy Paladin. However, it's not all smiles in the Paladin class, because while Holy Paladin is getting buffed, Retribution Paladin is getting nerfed. The explanation of the developers is that playtesting Retribution Paladin has revealed that this new talent combination has flooded the spec with Holy Power, way too much Holy Power than they would like. So, the nerfs in question are that Blade of Wrath now only resets the cooldown of Blade of Justice 50% more often instead of 100% more often. Final Verdict, the chance to activate Hammer of Wrath is now 10% instead of 15%. And lastly, Sanctification, the talent which made Consecration worth using in AoE, because Consecration ticks would give you a chance to gain holy power, ticks on the enemies inside Consecration. Now it's been nerfed by half. Now at max targets, 4 targets, it has an 8% chance per tick to give you extra holy power instead of 15% chance per tick. So all of these changes are in an attempt to reduce the amount of holy powers Retribution Paladin is gaining, which according to Blizzard, it's too much at the moment. Now, thank God, for one day, for one build, we don't have a wall of text of changes for Priest. So we can finally skip, for once, Priest in these type of videos and move directly into Rogue. Most of the changes to Rogues are going to be useless renames, like these renames or these renames. Not really much is changing. A few things are changing, however, particularly for subtlety. So, Shadow Dance has gotten nerfed significantly in the general 3, in the duration. Now it only lasts for 6 seconds, but now the subtlety 3 is going to have a new talent which is going to increase the duration of Shadow Dance by 2 and then 4 seconds. So if you are an Outlaw Rogue and an Assassination Rogue, you can still get a scuffed version of Shadow Dance, but if you are subtlety, you can spend 2 talent points to get your 10-second long version of Shadow Dance. There are a few other positive changes for subtlety, like Shadow Dance is still now baseline, so you get your extra charge baseline after you take it from the general 3 as well. You have Symbols of Death now also being baseline. You have your default passive Shadow Techniques also becoming baseline, and a few other nice additions like Finality, your current Shadowlands legendary, now has twice as much time to be able to be procced. Instead of 6 seconds of time, now you have 12 seconds to use it and continue cycling your finishers with this legendary turned talent in Dragonflight. We do also have the change talking about party buffs, talking about raid buffs, because up to this point this talent wasn't even working. Restless Crew. The infamous at this point talent of Outlaw Rogue, which is going to reduce your major damage cooldowns when the rogue uses a finisher, now has a 2 seconds internal global cooldown. So it can only proc once every 2 seconds. We will have to see the numbers in the end. After Rogue, Shaman doesn't really get many changes except for one, which is changes to their totems, and it's exactly the same changes as the ones for the Evoker's Zephyr. Now, these totems, Mana Spring Totem, Tranquil Air Totem, and Stone Skin Totem no longer will affect just the party. Instead, they will affect 5 nearby allies. In the case of Mana Spring Totem, which is a Mana Regen Totem, and in the case of Tranquil Air Totem, which is a anti-pushback, anti-interrupt type of totem, these 2 totems are going to prioritize healers. So, you don't need to have a shaman in the healer group to actually benefit from these totems to the healers. The also good change is that Mana Spring Totem, which used to be a 45-second cooldown totem on a 15-second duration, so basically a short cooldown, now no longer has a cooldown and lasts for 2 minutes. Basically now it's a permanent totem. Basically now it's Wind Fury Totem of Enhancement Shaman. It's like a mana battery, a slow background mana battery. It's interesting because it can stack. Unlike Wind Fury Totem, you can have 2 Resto Shamans, 1 Enhancement Shaman and 1 Elemental Shaman in your raid. All 4 of them now with Mana Spring Totem. That might prove actually powerful in the raid, depending on how much mana you actually gain back, obviously, but it does seem like it might be quite powerful to use. As soon as we see the numbers and how actually powerful it is, it's at the very least some hope. Some hope for Shaman for having something worth bringing in the raid. This is mostly all that we get for today. The last one in line is Warrior, which gets a whole slew of very tiny minor changes. You know, Avatar now grants 15 rage instead of 20. Thunderous Roar is 10 rage instead of 20. Spear of Bastion grants 20 rage instead of 25. Piercing Verdict now grants 100% more rage instead of 50% more rage. Fine, all of these tiny little numbers, and then the whole set of changes to the Protection Talent 3. Again, not too many, not too big, not too significant, I would say. The main one is the slight change to Last Stand, which now has a 3-minute cooldown instead of a 2-minute cooldown, with Bolster, the following talent, reducing the cooldown of Last Stand by just 1 minute. So the result is the same, but now perhaps you're not as pressed to take bolster with just a 1 minute cooldown reduction. That's the main one. Most of the other stuff is similar to the other changes of warriors, just tiny numbers being tuned left and right, nothing major being redesigned in this set of changes for warriors. So with all of this being grouped together, we have gotten a significant set of changes to the party and raid buffs. Besides the big nerf to Mark of the Wild, that's the standout, most of the others have been changed from working just in your party to actually working around you, so that you don't feel as pressured in putting the right players in the right parties, right? Playing Tetris, trying to stick them all together in your raid roster. That's, I guess, the idea that Blizzard had. And then some other changes here and there, a few buffs. Vengeance, Holy Paladin got some decent buffs, Subtlety Rogue as well, some nerfs as well. Retribution Paladin got nerfed, Restoration Druid got nerfed as well. And then the main change, talking about design philosophy and design choices, was basically the rework of the Balanced Druid tree. That has now gone live and playable in the beta. So with this said and done, we can now stop for today with this recap of the changes to this new build of the beta. Thanks, of course, as usual, for the support to all of my patrons, helping me a lot, contributing to me providing you with WoW content as we get deeper into this Dragonflight beta. It is very exciting to check out these things before the expansion goes live, as we get into the period about tuning the specs and classes, as we start thinking about who could be very good in the release of the expansion. That's always very nice to play around with. Also, if you want to support even more, you can like and comment down below on this video, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. That would be greatly appreciated to help me grow my channel around this community. Lastly, for more social interactions, general simping and parasocial relationships, you can follow me on Twitter, as well as subscribing to my Patreon. Write down these links right here. Now, thank you guys for watching. See you guys soon, and in the meantime, that's it. That's my hopium. My hopium is for Mana Spring Totem to be mandatory in the raid, so I don't have to worry anymore.